Many Zendons ago, when I was but a squidling, I remember learning about the First World War and seeing people like Harry Patch, Henry Allingham and Bill Stone being wheeled around at events that commemorated the First World War. By August 2009, all three of those men had died, and people kept saying that we'd lost our last link to the First World War. And it didn't strike me, it didn't hit me at that age, the importance of that. But then shortly afterwards someone said, oh no, there's some guy in Australia who also served in the First World War. And I thought, oh, okay. Anyway, as I got older and learnt more about history, I found out that he was a bit more than just some guy. Claude Choules was born just 6 weeks after the death of Queen Victoria, in a world completely different to our own. During his lifetime, things like powered flight happened. He actually personally witnessed the first airborne carrier assault on an air raid, essentially. He also witnessed things like the surrender of the German fleet after World War I, and then their scuttling the following year. His life really was like a boy's own adventure. He was a peacekeeper between the wars. He blew up a fortress off the coast of the Black Sea. He fought bushfires in Australia and diffused mines in World War II. On top of all of this, he was married for 76 years. That should be an achievement in and of itself. In his incredible life, he served 41 years in 2 different navies in 2 of the most destructive wars that mankind has ever known. When he died in 2011, we finally lost our last link to World War I. If only for that reason, the life of Claude Choules is a story from history that is worth telling.
Claude Stanley Choules was born on the 3rd of March 1901 in the village of Wyrepiddle, Worcestershire, England. Choules is apparently an Anglo-Saxon name meaning fisherman, appropriate for someone who'd spent 41 years in the Navy. Claude was born into a world completely alien to the one we know today. Queen Victoria had died just 6 weeks earlier. As a boy, he remembered things like helping to put out a house fire using a hand-pump fire engine drawn by 6 horses, and also the first car in the village which came with a man running in front of it with a red flag. His mother was the Welsh actress Madeline Wynne, but she left the family of 7 children, only 5 of whom would make it to adulthood, when Claude was just 5 years old. He had an active childhood as he played ice hockey and football and also enjoyed skating, running and fishing. In 1911, 2 of his older brothers would emigrate to Western Australia. Growing up, Claude had many heroes to aspire to. He revelled in stories of Captain Scott and his expeditions. His brothers in Australia joined up in World War I and managed to survive the entire Gallipoli campaign. And in his home village there was a man called Dick Goddard who'd go on to be a stoker on HMS Warrior during the Battle of Jutland. With all these stories whizzing around his head, he longed for adventure and a life in the military. At just 14, he tried joining the army as a bugler boy, but was turned down as too young. The Navy, however, would still take boy sailors. Just 1 month after his 14th birthday, he joined the training ship Mercury that was moored on the River Hamble on the south coast. Mercury was a 3-masted sailing ship left over from the previous century. This tradition of old training ships dated back to 1855, when a ship that was captured at Trafalgar was renamed Implacable and was moored up as a training ship. The Royal Navy kept many of these old wooden-hulled ships as training ships until the early 20th century. To this day, HMS Victory is still commissioned in the Royal Navy and is the oldest ship in the world to still be part of a serving navy. Claude's initial training included having to swim from the Mercury to the shore each day for training. Once the training was finished on the land, they'd swim back again. They also slept in hammocks. Later, he moved up to HMS Impregnable. Impregnable was the name given to a collection of old sailing ships that were moored together as a training establishment. The centre point was the enormous HMS Howe. Howe, along with her sister ship HMS Victoria, were commissioned in the mid-1800s, and at around 7,000 tons each were the largest wooden warships ever to sail the seas. By comparison, HMS Victory is only half that. Claude notes that he could sit with his legs outstretched in the gun port of Howe and his feet still wouldn't poke out of the side of the ship. The hull was at least 3 feet thick. She never actually put to sea because the first iron-hulled ship, HMS Warrior, was launched at the same time, making Howe obsolete. She was broken up in 1921. In 1917, at the age of 16, Claude finally joined the Grand Fleet of the Royal Navy. Upon joining the Navy proper, Claude served on the super dreadnought HMS Revenge. At around 620 feet long, with a displacement of 30,000 tons and armed with 8 15-inch guns, she was a little different to the wooden sailing ships he'd trained on. He describes the first time he witnessed a 15-inch turret firing as, "I could see the shells like 2 black discs rising in the sky and rapidly getting smaller on their way to the target 10 or 15 miles away. The heat, the shock and flash for anyone on the receiving end of these guns can be imagined when you realise that the firing of a broadside causes a 29,000-ton ship to roll 10 degrees away from the engaged side due to the recoil of the guns. It needs some punch to propel 8 15-inch shells, each weighing nearly 1 ton, over such a distance."
So on one occasion, while Claude was serving on HMS Revenge, they were practicing night manoeuvres. No radar in those days. You could only shoot at what you could hit. And part of the reason for the end of the Battle of Jutland was nightfall. So the British decided, right, we're not going to let the Germans get away with it again. We're going to practice night manoeuvres. Revenge was fitted with something like 9 massive million-candle power searchlights, and practicing this night manoeuvre. And they're just moving the ship into position, and right, there's a target out there somewhere. Searchlights on, and nothing happened. Not a single one of, I think it was 9 searchlights, worked. Suddenly, everyone's running around doing system checks and all sorts of things, and Revenge had to pull out of the battle line to see what was wrong. I thought it might be a major fault. Everything was found to be working, generators, circuitry. It was only when they examined the lights themselves, with massive cables to them, all of the cables had been cut. So the ship was immediately returned back to Scotland. Royal Marines and some, shall we say, secret agent types in suits and glasses and whatever came on board, and nobody was allowed to leave the ship. Everything was on lockdown, and everyone had their kit bags searched. One torpedo man was found to have a very large pair of wire cutters in his bag, and he was taken away and never seen or heard from again. Claude reckons he was probably shot as a spy, because we still did that sort of thing back then.
On the 16th of November 1917, Claude got his first taste of action. Revenge was scrambled against German surface vessels, but the only thing she destroyed with her guns was a Zeppelin. The German fleet was reluctant to engage the numerically superior Royal Navy. In July of 1918, HMS Revenge escorted HMS Furious on the now famous Tondern raid. Furious had been converted from a battle cruiser to a very early form of aircraft carrier. On the 19th of July, 7 Sopwith Camels took off from Furious to attack German airships based in Tonder, in modern-day Denmark. The time of the aircraft carrier was born, and Claude didn't know it yet, but the aircraft carrier would make dreadnoughts like Revenge virtually obsolete. In October 1918, there was talk of a major battle coming with the German Navy in the very near future. Britain thought it had learnt from Jutland 2 years earlier and was prepared to put an end to the German fleet once and for all. The only snag was the German Navy was mutinying back at home. The Royal Navy had a total of 43 battleships compared to Germany's 24. On the 11th of November, the Great War came to an end with the signing of the armistice. On the 15th of November, Admiral Murer of the German Navy arrived at the Forth of Firth to discuss the surrender of the German Navy. A week later, the Grand Fleet set sail to meet the German High Seas Fleet and accept their surrender. The Grand Fleet sailed in 2 lines 6 miles apart. At the head of one line was HMS Queen Elizabeth, and Claude's ship, HMS Revenge, was leading the other line. Each line stretched back about 15 miles, and the whole fleet consisted of 150 destroyers, 7 squadrons of cruisers, 2 squadrons of battle cruisers, and 5 squadrons of battleships. At sunrise, the Grand Fleet was ordered to action stations, just in case the Germans tried anything. When the 2 fleets met at 10 a.m, it was clear that the fight had left the German Navy. The Grand Fleet wheeled around and sailed with the High Seas Fleet back to Britain. Claude wrote, "When I looked astern from Revenge, there were warships as far as the eye could see, and much further. What an inspiring sight! Overhead, there were a couple of British airships to add to the spectacle. The German fleet had surrendered and the war was over. The Allies now had to decide what to do with all the German ships anchored in Scapa Flow. On the 21st of June 1919, Revenge was on a training exercise with other ships in the fleet and far out to sea. Claude was about to fire a torpedo when suddenly the ceasefire was sounded and orders given for boarding parties to make ready. When the fleet arrived back at Scapa Flow, they found many of the German ships had sunk and some were still sinking. The sailors of the High Seas Fleet had decided that if they couldn't crew their own ships, then nobody would, and they had sunk them themselves. Admiral von Reuter was brought aboard the Revenge and reprimanded for his fleet's conduct. He defended himself by pointing out that if the tables were turned, the Allies would probably have done the same. On the 19th of July 1919, Claude marched through London with 15,000 other servicemen in what became known as Peace Day. The troops marched past a new memorial that had been built out of wood. It was dedicated to the glorious dead and became known as the Cenotaph. This would eventually be replaced with a large stone monument, and veterans still march past it every year on the 11th of November. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20s, Claude found himself serving alongside Highlanders and a Punjabi regiment in Constantinople. He noticed that Gurkhas were being used as traffic cops. He was also a member of a boarding party from Revenge that marched through the streets of the city keeping order. Later they sailed to the Black Sea, where he found himself in a demolition party sent to blow up a fortress at Trebizond. In 1923 he joined the carrier HMS Eagle and served in the Mediterranean. While there he played football against Italian and Spanish teams, beating them regularly, but it sowed the seeds of interest in the sport around the Mediterranean countries. While aboard Eagle, Claude operated the aircraft crane on board and thereby aided in some of the earliest aircraft carrier practice. In 1924, the Eagle set sail for Port Said in Egypt in order to drop off the Gordon Highlanders, who were sent in to deal with the fallout of the assassination of General Lee Stack. In 1926, his term on HMS Eagle came to an end when he received an offer that would change his life forever. Claude was offered the position of instructor on loan to the Royal Australian Navy for 2 years. As it would mean promotion and a chance to travel, he leapt at the idea. The Royal Australian Navy was formed in 1911, and at the outbreak of World War I, they had 1 battle cruiser, 6 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 submarines, and over 5,000 sailors. This fledgling navy did have some successes in the Great War, such as when HMAS Sydney sank the German cruiser Emden in 1914. Leaving the UK in February, it took 6 weeks to sail to Australia on the SS Diogenes. During the journey, he met a woman called Ethel Wildgoose, who was one of 12 women on board as part of the Victoria League. The Victoria League is a charitable organisation set up after the Second Boer War to help civilians in times of war and hardship. Of Ethel, Claude said that she was a tall brunette with dark brown eyes, a real stunner. It was love at first sight, certainly on my part. First thing he had to do when he arrived in Australia was tackle massive bushfires. By July that year, he'd been offered a permanent transfer to the Australian Navy, and he accepted. After 12 months, he was promoted to petty officer, and on 3rd of December 1926, Claude and Ethel got married in Melbourne. It wasn't long before he was back in the UK. This time he was observing the building of a new cruiser, the HMAS Australia. Having transferred to the Australian Navy, he avoided the pay cuts that the Royal Navy suffered that led to the Invergordon Mutiny of 1931. Claude had many adventures in his time in the Navy. He talks about fishing with locals in Ghana and surfing in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Durban.
So in 1929, Claude was serving on HMAS Canberra, a new cruiser to the Australian Navy. And one day the crew noticed on the sort of notice board that they were going to be setting off on their round Australia trip on Friday the 13th of September. And navies are very superstitious, and the men said, do you mind if, there were rumblings among the men, they were due to set sail at something like 10 p.m. on Friday the 13th. And the crew came up with this idea that they should set sail sort of 2.25 hours later, so that they actually set sail at midnight midnight the morning of the 14th. And these mumblings sort of slowly trickled their way up the ranks. Officers heard about it, and finally it made its way to the captain. And the captain said, "No, we are sailing on our designated time." So they set off at 10 p.m. on Friday the 13th, and all was quiet for a week. I think it was shortly after they left Darwin. It was about the 20th of September, so a week later. Claude was in the shower, and he describes there was a terrible sort of grating, thudding noise. He said it was like a machine gun, but louder. And suddenly there was a call, "All hands clear lower decks." He thought, "Oh God, what's going on?" So he threw some clothes on, dashed upstairs. The ship had beached itself, or rather had run aground. The total damage was something like, it's cost something like £30,000 to repair, which is something like £2 million today. I think it's $2.5 million in today's money. I'm not exactly superstitious, but it's one of those, I hate to say I told you so.
1929 also marks the year that HMS Impregnable, the collection of old sailing ships used for training purposes back in England, was finally scrapped and the training establishment moved onto dry land. Claude was living in Sydney at this time and witnessed the harbour bridge being completed and opened. Other adventures included having his son christened on board HMS Sussex. He had his post delivered by a postman on horseback, and spent a lot of time with bushmen learning various survival skills and navigation. At one point he witnessed a friend shot in the stomach while hunting kangaroos, but he made a full recovery. Later, Claude notes that when his son started school, he was given a goat. He doesn't say whether the goat was given to him by the school, whether Claude gave him the goat, or where the goat came from, but for a while they had a goat as a pet. The outbreak of World War II found Claude based at the Naval Training Depot in Fremantle. One of his first jobs was fixing up hammocks inside a drill hall for troops stationed there. This called in his training from T.S. Mercury a quarter of a century earlier. Having been a torpedo man, his speciality was explosives. He trained ship's crews in the use of depth charges and demolition charges for all manner of ships and buildings. He also helped lay and repair a massive communication cable that became damaged off the coast of Fremantle. Initially, the war was quiet for Claude until Japan entered the war in December 1941. Suddenly, there was the threat of Japanese invasion, and the Australian coast was submitted to frequent air raids. Claude was suddenly up to his eyeballs in work. He had to booby-trap anything that could be used to land troops. Any pier, jet or wharf was laced with explosives. He also had to lay traps around ships at anchor, such as the Aquitania, the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth, in case any mini-submarines or saboteurs made attacks on the harbour.
So by this time, Claude was quite senior in the Australian Navy, and he was training lots of new recruits. And one day he was sent a recruit not long out of training to work with explosives, as was his expertise. Anyway, this new sailor thought he knew everything, didn't follow various safety procedures. One of the things they said was, if you're dealing with detonators and this sort of thing, you sit down and cross your legs. Part of the reason is if you drop the explosive, it's going to hit your thighs, and in theory it won't go off. You know, it's a nice soft landing. If it hits the ground, he didn't use the right tools for the job, that sort of thing. You know, there is health and safety. There is a point to health and safety, at least some of the time, especially with regards to explosives. And anyway, after a while, Claude and this guy didn't get on. He didn't give his name. But one day the kid got a transfer and went somewhere else. Claude didn't do it. In his book he says, you know, I had nothing to do with his transfer. It was all his own, what's it? Anyway, eventually word got back to Claude sometime later that the kid had died hadn't taken anyone with him, but he died in what was listed as a premature explosion. It happens to us all at some point.
Another part of his job was racing up and down the Australian coast defusing mines and torpedoes that washed up on the shore. The first of many came at the end of 1940 when a German mine washed up on 11 Mile Beach. Claude and a local policeman buried it and came back later, leaving a small trail of cuttlefish to locate it. When he returned, however, the cuttlefish had gone, so he had to poke around in the sand to try and find it without setting it off. Once the US were in the war, he had to train them in the use of towing cables to detonate mines, and also trained the crew of the submarine USS Holland in the use of specially made demolition charges for self-destruct purposes. Later in the war, he was taking half a ton of explosives in the form of depth charges to Geraldton. No escort or anything, just him and a driver, in a truck with the detonators on his lap. They came across 2 soldiers who were lost and had been out all night partying and were sure to be in trouble when they got back to base. Claude told them to follow him, which they did. Then his truck got a puncture, and then the spare popped as well. He walked to the nearest base to get help, and came back to find that the soldiers had repaired the tyre. He put in a good word for them, and instead of being reprimanded, they were commended for helping the Navy. He pointed out later that if the truck had flipped over due to the burst tyres, the whole thing could have gone up. After the fall of Singapore in February 1942, Claude found himself in a boat chasing a suspected Japanese submarine. They didn't find one, even after dropping a 1/4 ton of depth charges on its supposed location. August 1942 was a bad month for 2 ships that Claude had served on. On the 8th of August, HMAS Canberra was crippled by 24 shell hits from Japanese ships during the Battle of Savo Island. With her officers dead and her engine wrecked, the order was given to abandon ship, and she was sunk by gun and torpedo fire from 2 US destroyers the following day. 2 days later, the carrier, HMS Eagle, that Claude had served on in the mid-1920s as a crane operator, was torpedoed by a German U-boat and sank during the Battle of Malta. Although he didn't mention it in his book, he must have been worried about former shipmates still serving on these ships, and throughout both the British and Australian navies. The old battleship HMS Revenge was still going strong, however.
So, part of Australia's plan for dealing with the Japanese invasion was a sort of a scorched earth policy. There's a lot of Australia. You can give up a lot of land, a bit like the Russians. Claude's job as an explosives expert, he was essentially tasked with blowing up most of Fremantle. Anything that the Japanese could use to land ships, repair ships, feed troops, house troops, anything that could be used was to be blown up. There were precautions put in place, there were evacuation procedures put in place so that the population could make it out. His commanding officer once pointed out to him that he would probably be the last man to leave Fremantle. And there was a sort of it was amusing later. There was a family story went round. Claude used to cycle everywhere, kept him fit, etc. And the family story was this view of him pedalling furiously away from Fremantle as the whole town explodes behind him. The old phrase, cool guys don't look at explosions. Although cycling frantically away from it is not quite as dramatic, I don't think.
In 1943, he was sent to break up 15 flying boats in Roebuck Bay that had been shot up in a Japanese raid. At one point during this operation, he was nearly blown up by the Dutch destroyer Tromp. The Dutch Navy seemed to have it in for Claude. One day, back in Fremantle, the crew of another Dutch destroyer left their ship with an overpressurised torpedo. During his lunch break, there was an almighty bang. The torpedo had burst from the air pressure. It left 2 sailors wounded, and bits of metal and the explosive from the warhead all over the place. Claude pointed out that if it had triggered the warhead, that would have set off the rest of the torpedoes and the ship's magazine, and that would have probably taken a sizable chunk of Fremantle with it. He got a small amount of revenge in 1944, however, when he was sent to blow up a crippled Dutch submarine. He also observed men of Z Special Unit, often wrongly referred to as Z-Force, in their training to attack Japanese shipping. One of the instructors had been a mini-sub operator on one of the attacks on the Tirpitz. Claude noted that these men moved silently through the water with just their heads showing, and thought they looked like dolphins in the night. Their first attack was successful, but a later operation was discovered and several of the men were executed. Throughout the war, Claude met several former shipmates who were still serving. One of them was now the chief yeoman of signals on board the destroyer HMS Whelp. One of the officers on board was a certain Prince Philip of Mountbatten, fiancé to Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen. Claude points out that naval officers with titles are not often liked, but that Prince Philip was very popular with the crew, and later took command of the Whelp. In August 1945, peace broke out. Ships sounded their sirens and people danced in the street. Claude was instantly reminded of the end of the Great War, when he was in Scotland on board HMS Revenge, and the reaction was much the same. He'd survived 2 wars on a scale that was unimaginable, and his immediate job was removing all the booby traps he'd set up across the western coast of Australia. Standard practice was to take the explosives out to sea and dump them over the side. Most of them sank, but one depth charge malfunctioned and floated away. The crew couldn't get it, so Claude was sent to find it, but to no avail. 2 years later, it washed up on a beach, and he was sent yet again to destroy it. He was still serving in the Navy when HMS Revenge was finally broken up for scrap in 1948. In 1950, he joined the newly formed Naval Dockyard Police. This enabled him to continue serving his country and brought new challenges. He was sent on courses to learn firefighting, law, police work, and atomic warfare. This man, who'd started as a boy sailor tying knots and sleeping in a hammock on a sailing ship, was now training to tackle nuclear fallout. In March 1954, the Queen visited Australia, but there was a polio outbreak, and it was feared that if she caught it, she'd give it to the children. Claude was given a sentry box at the bottom of the gangway to the Queen's ship, and told that only the Queen, Prince Philip, and a few trusted assistants were allowed up. At the same time, his son was doing his national service in the army and had been picked to be a Queen's messenger. Claude felt that his family was well represented in the service to the monarch. In March 1956, Claude retired on his 55th birthday after 41 years serving in the Navy. He spent the next 10 years crayfishing and had all sorts of adventures with his wife and ever-growing family, including briefly having a penguin as a pet. Claude and Ethel were married for 76 years until 2003, when she died aged 98. Claude continued his active lifestyle and was still swimming in the sea when he turned 100 years old. When Harry Patch died in July of 2009, Claude was 108 years old and became the last surviving active service veteran of the First World War, and the only surviving veteran of both World Wars. Chief Petty Officer Claude Stanley Choules finally died on the 5th of May 2011, aged 110 years and 63 days old. He left behind 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 22 great-grandchildren, and 3 great-great-grandchildren. His funeral took place on the 20th of May in Fremantle, a town he'd been charged with destroying large parts of 65 years earlier. December that year, a landing ship bought off of the British Royal Fleet Auxiliary was renamed HMAS Choules in his honour. The naming was appropriate because, like Claude, the ship had served in both the British and the Australian navies. Claude's passing represented the last connection we had with the horrors of the Great War. The Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, said it best when she said, "Mr. Choules and his generation made a sacrifice for our freedom and liberty we will never forget." The boy sailor who'd joined up at 14, trained on a sailing ship from the previous century, watched the first air attack launched from an aircraft carrier, witnessed the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet and its later scuttling, kept relative peace in the Middle East, had a direct role in early aircraft carrier operations, had been responsible for keeping the coast of Western Australia safe from attack in the worst war in human history, and guarded the Queen's ship during a state visit. The life and adventures of Claude Choules was a story from history that was worth telling.